to the next piece of our lecture series. I'm first, for those of you who don't know, my name is Scott Shaw. I'm Interim Associate Dean here at the college. And we're rounding out our lecture series, and usually these things go where you round out with a flourish, and this is no exception. Olon Dotson I've known for many years, faculty member at Ball State, a gracious man, an intelligent man, and a thoughtful man, and someone I've been privileged to know for some time. Those of you interested in knowing more about Olon's work, and I'm sure you might talk about some of this, he's been in the Design Altruism blog. He's done things like leading students on the Distress Midwest tour, I think, where you go to things like Braddock, Pennsylvania, to try to understand how architects have behaved in those areas, how they might behave moving forward, how designers can have an impact in those areas. I think that as a piece of the lecture series, Olon is going to bring a conversation that maybe has not been a foregrounded part. And I'm really happy for that. And I thank you for coming here. As a shameless plug, I'll be speaking on Monday. We've done a terrible job promoting it because I think there was a snow day involved. So I'm talking on a random Monday. So I'm anticipating talking to like you. You know, the two of us will just sit here and I'll just look at you this entire time. So come, I have at least 3 interesting things to say. I'll let you know when those are done, and you can leave, 15 minutes in. And then Brian Phillips is talking next Thursday, and he's also one not to be missed. A very well-respected practitioner on the East Coast, Philly specifically, looking at modularity in architecture using weird things like Excel spreadsheets to try to understand how that could be a generator of architectural practice. And I'm sure he'll say at least a few things that inspire and or tick you off. I think that's an appropriate introduction to Olon as well, in that if you leave this auditorium not challenged, not a little bit miffed, you're not paying attention, right? So I fully expect you to give it undivided attention and to leave with at least a few quizzical glances and or head scratches. At least that's what I hope. So Olon, I think you can live up to that? Yes. Thank you for coming here, Olon.
I'll do the best I can. Scott is encouraging me to try to stir it up a little bit, and I appreciate it. I want to say welcome from Ball State University, which we're just about 4 hours southwest of you in Muncie, Indiana, about 60 miles northeast of Indianapolis. So I actually drove up because I come up here a lot for various reasons. So welcome from Ball State University, and I want to thank you, Scott, for inviting me, and thank the faculty and staff for being so accommodating today. So we'll get started here. Yeah, that is an interior of a Frank Lloyd Wright house in Gary, Indiana. However, I want to reassure you that I will not be focusing on Frank Lloyd Wright or his architecture tonight. I want to talk about this Midwest Distress Tour that Scott mentioned. Because this year Wes Jantz and I, who's up here in Detroit and Flint a lot, are celebrating our 10th anniversary of the Midwest Distress Tour. Back in 2006, I approached Wes about joining me on a trip with undergraduate and graduate students to visit severely distressed, abandoned spaces within a 250-mile radius of our campus. Not simply to engage in ruin porn, as so many of us do, although we would have been pioneers in that regard, but to observe the scale and magnitude of the abandonment that is so common in inner cities throughout not only the Midwest, the Rust Belt, but the country. And so in the spirit of that anniversary, I would like to go back 10 years and share some images, primarily taken by students, with the backdrop of a soundtrack that I organized to add texture to our journey. Wes later published an article simply entitled "Compared to What?", in which he began to ask many compelling questions about the state of our profession, and more importantly, the state of our society. So Muncie is, as I indicated, right here in relation to us. So some of these images are going to be, I'm going to be preaching to the choir tonight because I'm up here in the lion's den. Well, let's see how it goes. Gotta eat. Teamed up with SLARP out of University of Illinois there. we did a sequel. Hunter. So that was compared to what by the late Eddie Harris and Les McCann, who wrote for Roberta Flack around 1967. So, as with most African Americans of my generation who live in these environments, my parents were born in the South, and I spent most of my summers and holidays in Mississippi, smelling mimosa trees. I couldn't dress then either. Yeah, it's my father, who's still alive. He was born down there in 1929, and he spent his childhood. He used to talk to me about being behind a mule and how I haven't seen no work until I walk behind a mule. And one of my favorite books that kind of helps me to place my experiences between Indiana and Mississippi in context and history and time is Richard Wright's 12 Million Black Voices, which is a beautifully illustrated collection of photographs and poetry, or should I say prose. I mean, his writing is just poetry, and he kind of, in a brief, this is a kind of this paperback version of it that is quite thin. You could read it in a couple hours and spend more time looking at the photographs. But he kind of talks about the history of the United States of America from the perspective of his experiences. He talks about the lords of the land in the South and the bosses of the buildings in the North. Black folk are seen as the wretched of the earth, as Fanon would say, in the context of the American social construction of race. And the writing is just, Richard Wright's writing is just beautiful. And so I thought I'd share a couple of passages as he talks about the lords of the land, and then as we migrate to the north, the bosses of the buildings. Days come and days go, but our lives upon the land remain without hope. We do not care if the barns rot down. They do not belong to us anyway. No matter what improvement we may make upon the plantation, it would give us no claim upon the crop. In cold weather, we burn everything in sight to keep us warm. We strip boards from our shacks and from our struggling fences. During the winter days, we sit in the cabins that we have with no window panes, and the floors and roofs are made of thin planks of pine. Out in the backyard, over a hole dug in the clay, stands a horizontal slab of oak with an oval opening in it. And when it rains, a slow stink drifts over the wet fields. To supplement our scanty rations, we take our buckets and roam the hillsides for berries and nuts or wild greens. Sometimes we fish in the creeks. At other times, our black women tramp in the fields looking for bits of firewood, piling their aprons high, coming back to our cabin slowly like laden donkeys. If our shacks catch fire, there's nothing much we can do but to snatch our children out and run to a safe place and watch the flames eat the dry timbers. There is no fire wagon, and there is no but a little bit of water. Fire and other things has its way with us. And these are images not just contained in the book, but in general taken by photographers and sociologists during that period of what led to, or during the period of the Great Migration, in between the harvests, when children are actually allowed to go to school, when they're not working for the boss, for the lords of the land. And if you somehow feel compelled to challenge these structural systems, you might find yourself in the new Jim Crow, in the slavery by another name, with an overseer of a different kind supporting this prison industrial complex that's evolved over the last 150 years since the emancipation. And sometimes the weight became too much under lynchings and other structural systems, and folks decided that they wanted to seek refuge in the North because they heard that there were more opportunities there. And they traveled great miles. Some would suggest that it's the largest migration within a country in the history of human existence, traveling. We typically traveled straight north. So if I traveled to Detroit, most likely I came from Georgia or Alabama. If I traveled to Chicago or Milwaukee or Indianapolis, I probably came from Mississippi. If I grew up in eastern Georgia or South Carolina, I probably went up to New York or Baltimore or Philadelphia. And then I encountered the bosses of the buildings. See what I can find here, because my notes moved. Our defenseless eyes cloud with bewilderment when we learn that there are not enough houses to live in, and competing with us for shelter are thousands of poor migrant whites who have come up from the South just as we have. The cost of building a house is high, and building activities are on the downgrade. It is wartime, and new labor is coming in. from old countries across the sea. The only district we can live in is the area just beyond the business belt, a transition area where city factories and mills belch smoke and stains our clothes and lungs. We're not the only ones to move in these so-called transition area. It is the first port of call for the incoming horde of men who flow continuously into cities. The tenements we live in, the old, they are rarely repaired and replaced. On most of our buildings are signs, this property is for sale. Any day we can be told to move, that our home is going to be torn down and we have to make way for a new factory or a new mill. Actually, that is not the passage that I had marked, but it's all just so beautifully written. The bosses of the building seldom repair the kitchenettes in which we live. And a day after our children romp and play in the hallways and upon the stairways until the old buildings sway and creak as though ready to fall in the first high wind, often the bosses of the buildings refuse to pay taxes to the city and the Black Belt property, for they know that the amount of accumulated taxes will soon exceed the actual value of the buildings. After they have wrung from the last bit of profit, they allow the city to assume control of the dilapidated property. And when the whole area of our Black Belt have become filled with condemned buildings in which are dangerous for human habitation, the officials of the city will decide that it is unwise to demolish them, for the majority of us black folk will be without shelter, insomuch as the rest of the city is barred against us. In other words, I have to live in this restricted space and can't move anywhere else. And these are images from the D. He was talking about Chicago. These are images from Gary, and these are the kind of conditions that European immigrants encountered when they came. And then, decades later, African Americans would inhabit those same decrepit spaces. And every once in a while, you would see some new subdivisions segregated going in, like this Negro subdivision in Gary that people were so proud and excited to have, while others lived in lavish bungalows and craftsman-style homes, attending segregated schools in a new city, segregated classrooms, just like the ones they experienced in the South. There's no difference between the lords of the land and the bosses of the building. None whatsoever. And we are dealing with the remnants of this kind of institutional segregation, even today. These are ethnic cartography maps that I displayed in my TED talk a few years ago. What you see there with the blue dots are African Americans and the red dots are whites.
There's a lot of chocolate cities around. We've got Newark, we've got Gary. Somebody told me we got LA. Yeah. And we're working on Atlanta. Hey, we didn't get our 40 acres and a mule, but we did get you, CC. Yeah. You ain't alone yet. Moving in and around ya. A chocolate city is no dream. It's my piece of the rock. And I dig you, CC. God bless Chocolate City and its vanilla suburbs. Can y'all get to that?
George Clinton and Parliament Funkadelic from this 1975 album, Chocolate City. Of course, Chocolate City, he was referring to as CC or DC, which is no longer a chocolate city. It has been gentrified to the point that it's no longer can be classified as a chocolate city. But if you look at Detroit, especially that north side there, I always said it must have been a wall built because it was just so straight across there with respect to that, and that's a current map. It turns out there was a wall built, and we just saw it Of course, you all know that wall that's right around the corner from me on 8 Mile. Of course, it's all chocolate now. Parts of the wall are gone. But it's a monument that we should keep, just like walls in Berlin and Ireland, and walls that we're building between us and Mexico, walls that we're using to separate between Israel and Palestine, mostly on Palestinian land. And what's left inside the wall is institutional, physical, and social abandonment. When I was on that Midwest Distress tour, a young lady came to me named Marwa. She was from Egypt. And she had seen some pretty amazing sights over the years. She said, you all in the West like to talk about first world, second world, third world, and it suggested that I'm from the third world, but I've never seen anything like this. And I said, yeah, it's like a fourth world. It's beyond the third world. It's, you know, we like to say, just to be politically correct, that these are developing countries. So perhaps we're post-developing. Maybe that's what it is when I walk into a theater like this in Gary and it looks like a scene from Titanic. So I started toying around with this term, fourth world. And I thought that I had coined the term. And I found out that others had been written about it prior to me. Even Erykah Badu talked about the fourth world in this album, New America. Sociologist Manuel Castells talks about the fourth world and the digital divide. And in that context, back in 1974, First Nations individual George Manuel wrote a book called The Fourth World, an Indian Reality, and he was talking about it from the perspective of indigenous peoples, people that have sovereign nations within another sovereign state, like Aborigines in Australia, indigenous peoples, First Nations people in Canada, and Native Americans here. And folks all over the world that have these superstructures over their existence, hovering over them. Rowinski, and all these people claim that they coined the term fourth world. He started ATD Fourth World, and his position was that poverty, there's no excuse and no reason to have poverty on this planet, and that the presence of poverty in itself is a human rights condition. It's a human rights violation. So I kind of twisted and kind of put all these together from my own life experiences, and developed my own idea of this fourth world and fourth world theory. And I'll just kind of share some passages from my writings. Fourth world theory provides a framework for developing methodologies of examining and developing a greater understanding of the distress and abandonment commonly found in the cores of American cities, resulting from deindustrialization, historic segregation and discrimination patterns, like we've seen suburban sprawl, which is a response to those segregation patterns, erosion of a viable tax base, which we see in Detroit with 113,000 vacant lots and $18 billion in debt. And even though that's alleged resolved, it's really not. I'm just not going to cut a check, but I can find hundreds of millions of dollars to support a hockey stadium in a city that's 84% black. Civil rights legislation, fear, despair, crumbling infrastructure systems, disinvestment in urban school systems, and environmental justice issues. So this article, which is published in Buildings magazine, online and available, uses the analytical lens of fourth world theory to examine how structural and cultural forces contributed to the severely distressed conditions now found in the city of Gary. I was focusing on Gary and tracking its 100-year history from its founding as an industrial town to its post-industrial decline occurring during the city's and deteriorating its overall quality of life. And to illustrate that this is not an anomaly. This is an extreme example of something that we're all facing, and thus perhaps we're not just talking about fourth world cities, but perhaps we're talking about the fact that we live in a fourth world nation. The United States continues to be the wealthiest and most powerful country on earth, yet little attention is paid to the scale and magnitude of its poverty and degradation. The term sustainability is currently at the forefront of academic and popular discourse as part of a larger global imperative to reduce the effect of development on the natural environment. However, this is inconsequential when historic discrimination and segregation patterns and chronic societal ills dictate continued sprawling development patterns and practices throughout this country. We need to, as architects, really incorporate critical geography into our discourse, and look at folks like Bobby Wilson, who talks about class politics without modification of thought to the unique American experience. He says we must situate race not only in a historical context, but also in a historical geographical context. We must expose the skeletons of places and plant the flesh of Black experiences on those bones as well. Social practices are not only historically significant, but geographically are place-specific, even in the age of globalization. David Harvey is another one that I would encourage you all to read. Fourth world theory, as I indicated, is a critical investigation of society and culture through an analytical lens and an examination of the historical disparity that have been and continue to be replicated, and an examination of the historical, these structural and cultural forces that have contributed to severely distressed conditions we find in cities like Gary and Detroit and similar inner city communities, are not only the sole ingredient for placing America in serious jeopardy of collapse under the weight of its own history. What I'm starting to become interested in is not just these 113,000 vacant lots and the abandoned Packard plants and all the things that we've been looking at. I'm interested in the ever-increasing disparity and the uneven development and the steady expanding empty space, or what King eloquently described as the lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity that this nation must endeavor to confront. So when we go to these cities, we're not just going to look at a mile-long factory that's collapsing under the weight of its own history, a history of racism and segregation that existed at the Packard plant. But we're also trying to meet and greet and talk to people in these cities that are engaged in trying to make a difference, even if it's at an individual or a small group level, a grassroots level. So we've been back to Detroit many times. I'm here often, just going and having conversations with Malika Keeney, Feed 'em Freedom, or perhaps trying to see what this young man is trying to do out here at Southfield and how far he can get towards living totally off the grid. Or CDC Farm and Fisheries, not far from this campus. We've been doing it for years. This is my son, who is now 18, on one of my first early trips to Growing Power in Milwaukee, standing with Will Allen, who kind of adopted him. A lot of these folks are practicing architects now. And we take these ideas and bring them back into the studio environment and think about ways that we can revisit some of these industrial and post-industrial spaces and make them productive again. Perhaps doing urban farming. My first urban farming studio was in 1998. So all these challenges in the Midwest are overwhelming to me. And yet, I look at the South, the places that folks escaped from. Many of them are going back to these spaces that their ancestors once toiled in because of our post-industrial landscape and the lack of opportunities, or at least the lack of foresight that there are opportunities out there. And even my father would say that I'm going home. I could live in Gary or Detroit or Rochester or Milwaukee or Chicago or Buffalo or Pittsburgh or Cleveland for generations, for decades, but I still consider Mississippi home. And folks are going back home. There's kind of a reverse migration going on, but there's some serious challenges left over, because as we're dealing with a post-industrial landscape, these places are dealing with a post-agricultural landscape, a post-agricultural environment. And there's a lot of people struggling, and there's poverty similar to the kind of images that we saw early on, and yet we're not even farming. I stumbled across this article in the Washington Post back in July called "An Opportunity Gamed Away." And it was about this woman, Linda Faye Ingle Harris. And Linda Faye lives in Tunica, Mississippi, under the shadows of these casinos, which seem to always be present when there's severe distress. Just think about where casinos are located throughout this country. You know, we talk about Venturi, could have written Learning from Las Vegas. We need someone to write Learning from Atlantic City, because we always see and we're sold on the fact that these casinos are a solution. And in Tunica, there has been some huge tax revenue generated from that was supposed to benefit the people from the county. But yet what happened was it ended up being converted into tax breaks for the wealthy in that county. And then there was some golf courses built, an aquarium, and a tourist center for Tunica, Mississippi. And the community finally decided to step up and organize to fight this. And the county grudgingly decided to pave the roads in this area called the Sub, the Negro subdivision, that it was still had unpaved streets, open sewers, and no infrastructure whatsoever in the 21st century. They paved these streets with no engineering, just paved them. And oftentimes the streets were higher than the houses. And in this case, with this woman, her street is where my van is parked, the university vehicle, and her house is down below. I just paved it, and the water just runs off right into her house. Walking on her floor is like walking on a mattress. So Wes and I went down there in August and just had a conversation with her. We had nothing in mind, and she asked if we had any programs that might be able to help her with her situation. I said, well, you know, we do some design build work in Indiana. We've done some work, post-Katrina work in Bay St. Louis, Mississippi, and in New Orleans. But no, we don't really have any formal programs. Maybe we could, I don't know, team up with Mississippi State and explore some ideas. I went back and called Mississippi State, and there were concerns expressed about distance. And we're traveling 550 miles. So I don't know, that was kind of shocking to me, but nevertheless, they did turn me on to a woman named Emily Roush Elliott, who's based in Greenwood and had worked with their Carl Town Center and some of their outreach initiatives. And she is an Enterprise Rose Fellow and an activist architect. She's a social impact architect, some of the words that we're kicking around here on this campus. Look up Emily Roush Elliott. And she had access to some Katrina cottages. There were 4,000 Katrina cottages built to respond to the storm. And the State Emergency Management Agency was in control of a lot of them, and they donated some to Emily, to her organization, fully, the foundation, and they used it for low and moderate income housing in the county. And I wanted to just borrow one of these to use it for temporary housing for Linda Faye Ingle Harris while we demolished her home and built a new one in his place. But there were some legal conditions to the donation that wouldn't allow us to do that. It had to be used for permanent housing, and they were not to be let out of the county. So we've been working since August to try to see if we can get that restriction lifted, and just a couple of weeks ago, we were able to get that lifted. And so we moved forward with trying to figure out how, in studio, how we can use a couple of these one-bedroom Katrina cottages to create a 3-bedroom house so that we can replace what she had, at least with respect to the number of bedrooms. And these are student designs, preliminary designs that were presented to Miss Ingle Harris this past weekend. So yes, I'm here in Detroit, and Sunday I was driving back from Mississippi. So what the students are exploring is the idea of taking these 2 Katrina cottages, this is really earth-shattering stuff, putting them side by side, and then connecting them with some kind of center unit. We have 3 different designs that we're exploring. This is one of them. So what you see here is that is a Katrina cottage, and this is a Katrina cottage. And here's a simple space bridging the 2. And then we got big time porch because we're down home. And that's what you got to do for many reasons. One is it's an African contribution to American architecture, and it's a social space, and it's a way to really expand the square footage of a house without creating a lot of interior space. And it works in the South. It works in the North, but it's inappropriate. So this was one of the teams' designs. We had 3 teams of 4 that presented designs, and now what we're working on as we speak, they're down there duking it out, is marrying the 3 designs into one. And they have some similarities, and we think we can pull it off. So you can see these are the elevations from the Katrina cottage. The porch of the Katrina cottage was, in this particular design, was in this space, and we enclosed it and extended the roof out and added an additional porch. And so, because we needed the square footage in the house. I think the students really responded well to this assignment, and they really got into it. It's pretty emotionally uplifting. And I always say in studio and in my lectures that there's a fine line between empathy and sympathy. You know, Mrs. Harris is a school teacher, and she is not necessarily under the same degree of poverty as many of the people that exist in that area, but she's dedicated to being in that area and remaining in that area. And she's a model for that community. And she was most affected by this poor excuse for engineering because of the proximity of her house to the street. So yes, we presented 3 designs and walked through it, and she seemed to be pretty pleased with the ideas of reusing these Katrina cottages. And then after this presentation, we left and went down to Greenwood. Actually, we were in Greenwood where the Katrina cottages were, and went out and looked at them and looked at how we're going to modify them. And then after that, we went down to the Mississippi River and just kind of reflected on the work that we're trying to do and the challenges that our society as a whole is facing. Speaking of that challenge, I kind of organized my presentation today after a conversation I had with Scott to share another situation with you. This is Emily Rouse Harris, and Ms. Karen Ketty, my colleague on the left there, and one of my students, Zach Isaacs. And that's the 1-bedroom Katrina cottage in the background. And this was our trip in the fall. And as I had indicated earlier in this presentation, my son, in this picture, he was 7, and he's been on as many of these trips that we go to different cities as possible, if I can make it happen with this school schedule. He might be on fall break or on spring break, or some of our trips, like to the plant in Chicago, this might be a weekend trip where we can turn around and come back. And so he's gained a wealth of knowledge. Probably didn't appreciate as much what he's looking at here with this aquaponics system, one of the most sophisticated urban farms in the world. Growing Power is a laboratory. It's pretty amazing. If you haven't been there, you must go. So I took him on this trip in the fall. It was a whirlwind southern trip where we went to Atlanta. While we were in Atlanta, we did some architectural stuff. We went to the High Museum and looked at Richard Meyer's building and Renzo Piano's addition. And my son loves art. He's a little artist, very quiet kid. Then we went to visit TVS. One of our graduates is the CEO of that firm in Atlanta, and they do a lot of large-scale work, convention centers, and they were able to accommodate our tour. Went to Georgia Tech, and a lot of our students, we have a 4-2 program, are thinking about graduate school and went to visit theirs. Went to a project that I just finished in Birmingham for the Negro League Museum, next to their AAA baseball stadium. Went down to the Rural Studio, which I've been going to for almost 3 decades now, and watching that work continue to evolve in wonderful ways and continue to question our role and our relationship with the people that it's serving. Left the Rural Studio and went down to Montgomery, Alabama, and looked at Maya Lynn's work across the street from the Southern Poverty Law Center. I got this slide out of order. That was still at the Rural Studio, so we had some playtime. Never too old to play. And then we went on down to New Orleans. We got there Wednesday evening, October the 8th. And this is my son at Cafe du Monde. And I told my son and the students to have some beignets, and I was going to move over to the hotel and check in, and then I would meet them on the corner of Canal and Bourbon Street. And I said, when you leave the Cafe du Monde, I want you to walk through Pat O'Brien's, which is an amazing courtyard space, but it was over 21 environment, and my son's only 18 with these graduate students. So I told him to walk around to the other side and meet them there, which he did. He thought the other side was the opposite side of the block as opposed to emptying out on Bourbon Street, so he was standing on the opposite side of the block waiting. I was on the phone with him as I was checking in, just chatting with him, and suddenly he screamed. I didn't know what had happened. I tried to call him back, and someone answered the phone and hung it up. I called back again. Someone answered the phone and hung it up. I called back a third time, and someone answered the phone and hung it up. So I called the New Orleans Police Department and asked me if I wanted to file a missing persons report. I thought maybe my son had been mugged or attacked and someone stole his iPhone. And they said, sure. They called me back in about 10 minutes and said, we have your son. I was so happy. I went down to the police station and saw my son sitting there. And he hadn't been attacked by citizens at all. He had been attacked by the police officers, just like I was when I was his age. They slammed him up against the wall, permanently scarred his shoulder. And I'm on this. They're not going to get away with it. I don't know how to manipulate this. Here. These bastards snatched my son, handcuffed him, and escorted him to the precinct, and they wouldn't release him into my custody. That's my son being dragged down the street. And they threw him into the most notorious jail in the United States of America, the Olon Parish Prison. And they put him in a cell with a 40-year-old man. The man was a Muslim. The man told my son, don't worry, everything's going to be okay. My son they didn't give him any provisions. He was just laying in there. And the man took out his jumpsuit and laid it over my son to keep him warm. He said, what's your name, young man? My son said, my name is Lyle. He said, oh, you must be named after Lyle Mays, jazz musician. And my son said, as a matter of fact, I am. Not a lot of people know Lyle Mays. He said, yeah, I know Lyle. I'm a jazz man. I'm a jazz musician. But I've been in this prison for 6 months. I haven't had a hearing yet. No bail. And right now I got to take a dump. I'm sorry, it's graphic. But we haven't had toilet paper for weeks. So he took his girlfriend's letter out and wiped his ass with it. This is the United States of America, where we have 25% of the world's incarcerated population. Next day, I took my students who were visiting Tulane to the hearing, and the students were very upset because they knew my son. You know, you hear about this kind of stuff, but you don't really think about it. They sat there, and my son came out in a ball and chain with an orange suit on, chained to a man who was in there for attempted murder by strangulation. So we've been, we had some business to take care of. I was able to get him out, fortunately, and we left New Orleans, and a city that I've been volunteering in since Katrina. I've been down there 21 times since Katrina doing this kind of work, not only in New Orleans, but in other cities. And for what? And we went on up and met Linda Faye Harris, and this is my son the next day with the students. They gave him his shoes back, but he had no shoestrings. So my son's been doing some drawings to try to help work through this. I think I'm in worse shape than he is. He's inspired, as you can see, for those of you familiar with the artist Jean-Michel Basquiat. He calls himself King Lao. And lately his drawings have become a little bit more uplifting. And this is a piece that he did for my dear friend Karen Ketty on the trip. Because Black Lives Matter. Thank you. Yeah, I really went off on a tangent, but a conversation led me there. You guys are very fortunate to have Scott Shaw here. He's a special person. And to run into Scott, I'm going to run into him at places like Structures of Inclusion conferences. That's where we all need to be. Because we're all in this together. And you cannot isolate yourself from these challenges. We cannot sprawl enough to sweep it under the rug. You guys are going to be particularly challenged because this is the kind of work you're going to be doing, because this is all the work we got. We're not going to be doing polished granite bank towers and the kind of stuff we were doing when I escaped from my asylum. We have endeavored to establish a minor in social and environmental justice, and for our graduate students, a certificate in social and environmental justice. And you wouldn't believe the amount of resistance that we had in establishing that minor and that certificate, not only from our from those who don't see any value in it, but from our own colleagues and alumni. But we're proud that we've got it through, that we're going to be offering it to students. And what we're encouraging students to do by offering this minor is to go out and take classes in sociology, take classes in critical geography, take classes in criminal justice, take classes in philosophy, and bring it back. And at the same time, we're encouraging students in those fields, in those humanities, in other fields, to come into our building and take classes like Fourth World Theory or Wes's Architects of Hope. Because it's important to engage in difficult dialogue, to engage in discourse, to write about it, and for all of us to become what Grace Lee Boggs would say, the late Grace Lee Boggs, organic intellectuals, a Gramsci term that's used often, because we never stop learning. You don't just graduate from here and you're done. We're always evolving. I am not in the same place I was when I took that Midwest Distress Tour 10 years ago. I'm in a totally different place. I am not even in the same place I was before I had lunch with Scott Shaw today. We need to constantly be critical. And that doesn't mean to criticize, that means to be critical. We're college students. And we need to question our own positions. We need to play devil's advocate with ourselves. That's what higher education is all about. But it doesn't even stop here. So I encourage you to challenge, to ask questions, not just to look at what you see in this city, but how can that be in this country? It's easy to just turn away from it. Sleep at night. But don't let it bring you down, because there's a lot of people out there trying to make a difference. Grace Lee Boggs used to always say that we are the leaders that we've been looking for. The last time I saw her alive, I said, I heard that a little bird told me that you're interested in rewriting the Constitution of the United States of America and publishing it on your 100th birthday. Is that true? And she kind of leaned back and smiled and recited the preamble to the Constitution, word for word. And then she started talking about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And she talked about how you and you and you have a tremendous responsibility in order to have that privilege. And we're all in this together. So I'm opening it up for questions.
All right, now calm down. We'll go in order.
There's a
get to
line.
every one of you, I
we
promise.
can take some tickets, take numbers.
I have a question.
Yeah,
So was there
icebreaker.
something that happened? So at one point in time, you were in an auditorium, probably looked a little different than this, right? But surrounded by colleagues, all trying to understand what it means to be an architect, what it means to be a designer, what it means to be a creative individual. Was there something that occurred to you at that moment, someone that kind of influenced you at that moment, that set you on this trajectory? How did you go from the spot where most of the people in this auditorium are to where you are now, and what are, I guess, some things that you would share in that journey?
Well, I would have to say that life experiences brought me to where I am from the time that I was a little child. One thing that I do love about you all, and what I hear all the time with our first-year students, why do you want to go into this profession? And 90% of them say that they want to go into this profession because they want to make a difference in their community or in somebody's community. They want to improve the quality of life, or somehow at least endeavor to help improve the quality of life. So I think that it's a calling for us to pursue this profession. It's a calling. And it might steer you in a lot of different directions, because there's so many things you can do to achieve that. You might graduate from here and go work in a community development corporation and never pursue architectural registration, but you're making a greater impact than a lot of registered architects could ever think of making. It's just whatever you do. And I grew up in actually in the kind of the suburbs of Indianapolis. And my parents separated when I was 7, and neither one of them could continue to afford to live in that environment. So I moved to the inner city, to areas that are comparable to a lot of the stuff we see in Detroit, and Flint, and Gary, and East Chicago, and East St. Louis, and Camden, and Braddock, and these cities we looked at. I think if I had grown up in that environment, I wouldn't have had the questions that I had moving there. Most people don't move back into the hood. And that's changed my life. I started having difficulties with vacancy, with vacant lots. And my goal was I wanted to come in and fill in these spaces. If I wouldn't have been an architect, I would have been a dentist. You know, I just wanted to come in and fill in these voids. And that kind of took me on my trajectory and led me to the field. And even after I finished undergraduate, I worked for a few years, and then I went back in real estate development at Columbia. Not because I wanted to be a developer, but because I wanted to understand the development process. And that's really what that program is about, and is the development process. So that I could come back and do, actually we've done some pretty significant housing and community revitalization efforts all over the United States. I wasn't sleeping at night doing that kind of work. I was burning my candle at both ends. And I had an opportunity to teach a studio at Ball State, and I went up and taught it because I was working on a Hope 6 there that I was able to get awarded. So I was there anyway, and I really loved it. And then I found myself in the academy. When I was in school, I was like, I would never be in the academy. There's no way. Teachers don't know anything about the real world. They're just here, you know, they're fronting. You don't know. And we don't know what we don't know. And slowly, over about a 10-year period, I kind of transitioned to the academy. And I've been teaching ever since. I've been at Ball State for 17 years now, and I love it. And I love the fact that I have the freedom to ask these kind of questions. The academy wants you to. If you're in an environment where you can't ask questions, then you shouldn't be in that environment. I don't care how much you're getting paid. Yeah.
Other questions?
It's a quiet group.
It really is. I think you stunned them.
You know, it's difficult. So oftentimes in a larger environment like this, people are reluctant to ask questions. It's okay.
I appreciate that. I get no exercise,
getting a
no
workout.
physical activity whatsoever. I appreciate it. If someone, Philip, if you could ask the next question, that would be.
I guess, can you guys hear me? All right.
Very
I guess
well.
my question is, since you're a person, you know, probably more so than anybody in this room that's been all over the country and has seen these places and talked to the people that lived in them, I'm just wondering, like, usually when you want to do some type of revitalization, you know, a lot of people have ideas that aren't necessarily aligned with the people that live there. You know what I mean? They're not really thinking about what they actually need.
Absolutely.
They just want to come in and let's just bulldoze this down and let's just make it different. And what I guess what I'm wondering is, like, just like collectively throughout all these places you've been, what is it that like sticks out in the forefront of your mind that what people would like to see happen in these you know, like these blighted areas, in these areas of poverty? Like what is it that they need the most? As like, so as a engineer, as an architect that is interested in doing this, what is the most significant? I know there's a lot, but what's the most significant thing, like collectively, that you've come across in your career?
Well, one of the most a critical moment in my life was I had a wonderful student who graduated about 10, 12 years ago named Mike Pardek. He lives in Boston, and he's from a little town, Dwyer, Indiana. And he took my studio, and all of my studios throughout my experience are dealing with some kind of inner city issues. And he decided to pursue looking and re-examining the proposal to rehabilitate the area that was formerly occupied by Stateway Gardens and Robert Taylor Homes in Chicago for his thesis. And he asked me to be his advisor. And we worked tirelessly together. He went up there many times and looked at different layouts and different proposals, examined what was being proposed on the site, and looked at alternatives plans. And at one point, he just finally got lost. He got lost in it. And I couldn't really, it seemed like I wasn't reaching him to help him. And we had a wonderful urban planner faculty in our department who passed away. Her name was Linda Keys, Dr. Linda Keys. And I said, you need to have a conversation with her because she's from there. At least you'd have some access to someone who grew up there. She wasn't from Robert Taylor, but she was from the area. And she sat down with him, and he said, you know, Dr. Keys, I just don't understand what people want. I mean, because this is a thesis and it's hypothetical, I just don't really, you know, I don't really have access to the people. I can't just walk up to somebody. I don't know what the people want. What do they want? And she looked at him and said, they want the same damn thing you want. And that just changed his whole approach to the project. He did a beautiful project. And he started at the dining room table because that was something that meant something to him in his house. At that dining room table, there was a light over it. He said that that's where I learned how to read. That's what my parents taught me how to read. I was watching my dad, and he'd be paying the bills at that table. We would pray at that table when it was dinner time. And when I was a teenager and I'd be out too late and I'd come home and the light was on over that table, I knew I was in trouble. And he designed the community from that table out. At the same time, however, we have a tendency to feel that what we have to offer is what they need. You know, because again, if I take that sympathetic approach to working in these environments, then oftentimes I become a missionary. And there's many examples out there of failed efforts that were grounded in good intentions. So what we have to find is the balance between that and empathy. Wes likes to use the term solidarity because we are all in this together, as opposed to empathy even. He's starting to question empathy. So yeah, we also have to realize that we are facilitators. Neil Pereira talks about that we as practitioners are facilitators of the people's process. We're not necessarily leaders. We need to facilitate the process. And that'll help us to come off of our high horses when we know what's right for you. There was a gentleman, Brian Sinclair, that told me a story once about some First Nations people in Canada that he worked with, and they decided that they were going to design some nice ranch-style houses for this community up off of the Hudson Bay so that they can have something like they have down in Saskatchewan or in Calgary, Alberta. Suburban-style ranch houses with carports. And they designed this community for these nice little houses. Folks occupied them, and they went up there to see them a few years later, and there was all kind of stuff in the yard. They went into one of the houses, and nobody occupied the 3 bedrooms that they had provided for them or the kitchen. everyone was in one room and there were burn spots on the wall. Went into another room and people were slaughtering in there and there was blood all over the wall. And they were like, these people don't appreciate what we gave them. We did the same thing in Sri Lanka. After the tsunami, we went there and built some houses, and architects did all these wonderful things for these Sri Lankan tsunami victims, and went back and people were cutting holes in the roof, and the holes were made out of ceramic tile that wasn't local to the area, that had to be brought in, but it looked good. And the reason they cut these holes in the walls and the roof is because they don't cook inside. Did anybody ask them? So there's got to be a balance there. But I think we need to transition our role into that of being a facilitator.
You mentioned that you encourage your students to take courses across disciplinary lines. My question is that since the academia and the university structure has quite a lot of resources and connections and networks available to it, and then a whole host of young talent across so many disciplinary lines, at what level of responsibility do you think that universities have to pool together more of a holistic effort, or bring together all of the people that are trying to make a difference into, and then give this host of talent more of a centralized structure to do this work?
Are you saying within universities?
Yes,
like
within universities.
Within a university, for example, Lawrence Tech.
Right.
Not the relationship between Lawrence Tech and Ball State, for example.
No, I think maybe individually, like you, we set curriculum here.
Yes.
We have certification programs, and within a university,
yes,
we start there, right?
Yeah, we have this. We have a wonderful College of Architecture and Planning at Ball State. And we have architecture, landscape architecture, and urban planning. We also have an urban design program down in Indianapolis that we run out of that college. And we have a historic preservation program within architecture. And within that, there's a lot of, for a better word, segregation. The planners over here. And all of our students come in as CAP students as freshmen. I had 2 interns working for me a few years ago. One was a planner and one was an architect. And the architect said to the planner, "Hey, Kate, I used to know you." Because they were in first year together, but then when they went to second year, they went their separate ways. And we're in the same building and don't even interact with each other. And I used to think that, well, the planners are being territorial, and the planners probably think we're being territorial, but really what it is curriculum. And it is our own accrediting bodies and the pressure that they put on us to offer these very specific, specialized courses. And we have to really come up with creative ways to pool our resources in the way that you described. We have to be creative. And creating these minors is one way. Another way is to question the accrediting bodies about what it is that architects are being taught, because a lot of people see us as being trained. I don't even like to use that word. What is that? It's a vocation. It's not a vocation. So we just have to challenge these systems, and it took me 10 years to come up with this idea of a minor and a certificate in social and environmental justice. And it'll probably take another 10 years for it to really become institutionally effective. It's a challenge. All we can do is try. yes. Look at that, we got questions now.
So you're talking about, in the first question, you mentioned about architects came over to Sri Lanka and they built these homes for the people, but it's not what the people needed. I think that happened.
It was nice though, it was cute.
Yeah, it was nice, cute.
They were kind of peach and they were stucco and they had the, you know, had little nice yards and
then
they built a
environment.
community center that hasn't been touched.
It's adorable, yeah.
I can show you pictures of it on my external here.
And I think, well, that's happened in the past a lot. Like when we built homes for the poor in the Great Depression, people still stayed in their impoverished homes. And have you ever felt when you were going to these communities where people were living in those types of places that they kind of predicted this sort of backlash before you did? Like, have you ever felt sort of unwelcome going to a community?
Absolutely.
And how, I guess, how do you
The
combat
biggest
that?
compliment, and you guys have to excuse my language, right? But we just heard compared to what? The biggest compliment I ever got was on my first public housing redevelopment, I went into, I had on a suit. And I went to a community meeting and somebody said, "Who's this sellout motherfucker?" I was like, damn, you know? I said, well, we're the architects and and this other cat walked over to him and he said, "Man, you don't know that guy, man? They did Hawthorne Place out on 32nd and Emerson, man. They laid them motherfuckers out." And that was the biggest compliment I ever got in my career. They laid them motherfuckers out, you know. But there's some barriers. And one thing that I learned in working in large, and it's case by case. I mean, I could work on a development in Fort Wayne, and people are like, you know, and then I go through the same, you know, I might have the same statistical basis in Toledo, and everybody's all over it. So it's case by case, depending on some really interesting dynamics. Like, you know, there's usually some matriarch when you're working in the community. And if there's an absence of that, oftentimes the term William Julius Wilson uses is social organization. You can have a community that's impoverished, but if there's strong social organization, then that community is healthier than maybe a middle-class community that's not. And those things are very dynamic, and they boil down to even individual's personality. Well, you gotta, you know, you can just do your best. It's really challenging. The one thing that I learned is, again, like this big room, and you know, there's not a lot of us in here because I probably need to design some shinier buildings. I don't know, but maybe more organic and get some people and have $500 a square foot, and you know, I'll be rolling. But until then, what I learned in working in many inner cities is that people are reluctant to talk in a large forum. There might be 2 or 3 people that, oh man, you know, some louder people, but in general, people are reluctant to talk. We actually did a development where we met and we broke everyone up into block clubs based on their building or their area or their territory, and had little small meetings. We had 135 meetings. Now that, you know, if I'm looking to at fee, you know, that probably wasn't the widest thing to do, but you know, what good is it to have a nice fee and you end up designing Pruitt-Igoe? I mean, where would he have lived if he had, you know, he designed that thing, but where would he have lived? And what did he have to say about it? All he had to say was, man, I just can't believe people could be that destructive. I mean, you watch the Pruitt-Igoe myth. We have a tendency to take responsibility for our successes, and we distance ourselves from our failures. Oh yeah, it's the people. The design didn't have anything to do with that. There's high-rises in New York that are working. All these buildings are coming down. But by breaking into small groups, we were meeting with 4 or 5 people sitting in a circle, and everybody had something to say. And then we documented all that, and we brought it back to the larger group and said, you know, this is what was said here, this is what was said here. People do not like to, they like to have a kitchen that faces the open space in the rear so that they can, and with a window, so that they can see the children playing in the back. People like the idea of porches, whatever it is, you know, and it wasn't things that I was saying that, you know, you need. They were speaking up. So that kind of goes back to your question earlier, is if you break it down, people are more engaged. And you just have to put forth the extra effort to have multiple informal meetings like that. And always have some food. Food's got to be good too. Don't just roll up in there with some, you know, have some food, man. I had another MF compliment here in Detroit, by the way. We did some work for a homeless shelter on 3rd and Martin Luther King here. And I cooked gumbo for them and brought it up, and we had gumbo. And some of these people, a lot of these people got Southern roots again, and they hadn't had gumbo in forever. And we had gumbo there, and at the end of the day, somebody said, who made this gumbo? And everybody pointed at me, and I said, yeah. And you put your foot all up in that motherfucker. And I was like, okay, thank you, thank you, yeah. All of my compliments include foul language. I don't know why, but yeah. All right. Are you going to use foul language?
I hope so.
Hell yes.
There you go. Okay. That's a start. My virgin ears are.
You talked about walls, like how the 8-mile border of Detroit is such a stark contrast. And that's a very physical thing. And building emergency shelter and like public housing, those are all like architecturally physical things that traditionally, you know, you look up humanitarian architecture, you know, that's what we could do. But when I think about the problems that we have, and you know, that just make me shake my head, like when I hear people on the news, you know, saying all lives matter and stuff like that, and when we have in this presidential race, you know, talking about walls, and it's obvious that we have bigger issues. And like just in Detroit, when you look at the new M1 rail going in, and you look at the development in Midtown, and it's obvious what this stuff is for, who this is for.
Right.
So.
And they know that.
When you think about the G word, gentrification, how, you know, I almost don't want anything to do with it anymore. Like, how do you reconcile being someone who wants to design these buildings, but also what that means, you know, economically and with our divides? I guess what I'm saying is, you know, should I just, when I feel like I want to give up and just be like a journalist or something, you know, what should I, what would you say?
Hey, it's possible I can come back. I'm going to come back on that one. You know, I don't know. I'm going to kind of go off on a tangent there, but I was, when I was at Columbia, I was really stressed and disappointed in our society. And I mean, when I go home every day and turn on any kind of cable news or local or whatever, you know, and listen to some of the language that's being passed back and forth, it actually drains all my energy, and I just go to bed. And I wonder if we are, when I think about, I have this love-hate relationship with sports, for example. I mean, I'm very critical of these publicly funded stadiums like the one I described here, or the one that's replacing the one that was built in 1996 in Atlanta right now in a historic African-American neighborhood, or all over. And who is benefiting from that hockey stadium, right? But they say it provides jobs. There's one of many documentaries I use. One is called Battle for Brooklyn, that talks about the stadium for the Nets. It's pretty disturbing. But there's 4 documentaries right now on gentrification just in Brooklyn. There's My Brooklyn, there's Brooklyn Boheme, there's the domino effect on the domino. But going back to my depressed state, I guess you could say, I was sitting with a cat that I didn't know very well while I was in grad school, and I said, and my wife at the time was pregnant with my daughter, and I said, man, you know, this is just messed up, man. I mean, you know, there's just no hope for this. There's no hope. You know, this country is going to hell. I say that maybe 2 or 3 times a week. And he said to me, he said, well, so why are you bringing the child into it? Why do you want to bring your child into that hell? I mean, was it an accident, or did you don't really care what happens to her? And just left me hanging there, you know. Like, why do we get up in the morning? And there are many of us who don't. The term that we see, nihilistic thinking, you know, we see this as a dystopia, and we're living in the matrix, you know. But I haven't allowed it to get me to the point where I lose hope in the midst of all this despair, because I get a lot of energy from engaging in this kind of discourse, and then hearing about something that someone did weeks, months, years later, you know, that might be a partial contribution to improving our overall quality of life. All these things are very difficult. One of the slides I had there on that show was from Youngstown. I was in Youngstown, and we met this guy, Hunter, who was a city planner and based in Youngstown. He's now kind of dealing with the whole industrial corridor between Pittsburgh and Cleveland, Northeast Ohio Economic Development Corporation that he founded. And he said at the end of that table, and right when I took that picture, he said, "We're not coming back." You know, this was 2008. He said, "You know, Obama's been here, Hillary's been here, McCain's been here, and they all are talking about bringing these industrial jobs back. We're going to bring these jobs back. The factories aren't even here anymore. They didn't even go out there and see. They've been torn down. We were the 4th largest steel producing city in the country, and that's gone. It's over. We are not coming back." So what I have to do is, my responsibility is to try to see what I can do for the quality of life for the 80,000 people that remain here, to make it the best Youngstown it can be within that limitation. And I think that this, you know, they were the first city to look at shutting down certain parts of the city. in order so that they wouldn't have to maintain the infrastructure, something that Detroit Works and Detroit Future Cities struggling with. They were the first, and one thing that they underestimated was the emotional attachment that people have to place. Yes, I'm living in a dilapidated home down on the end of the block, but that was my home, that was my father's home, and that was my grandfather's home. He came here from Poland, and I'm not going anywhere. Take me off the grid. They just saw people would just take a check and just jump on it. And I don't know what they were doing over at Future City, but they didn't look at Youngstown example, because that was before. Everything is a dichotomy. Even if I think I'm doing the right thing, I think that is one of the most incredible planning documents that was ever created. Detroit Future City. It is incredible. It's impressive. But it fails in so many ways. And so what we're trying to do is kind of up the idea that citizens were involved in the creation of it. And they were, but not to, we had they put people's name in there as supporters who actually opposed it. We haven't really come to grips with civil rights. We never really engaged in truth and reconciliation. We just passed some laws, and people said, okay, we're going to desegregate. I'm just going to move outside of that sphere of influence. And we are part of the growth industry and the growth lobby, so we supported that. This light rail system is no different than the freeways that were built 50 years earlier. They were designed to bring people downtown? No. They were escape routes to facilitate unimaginable sprawl, stuff that even the planners couldn't imagine. But there's got to be a reason to get up in the morning. And I always like to go to bed at night knowing that I tried that day something to make a difference. Something, whatever it is. I've failed many times, but I tried, and so I can sleep at night. And I'm honest about my failures. All you can do is try. And that path is going to find you. It's going to find you. You're going to be like, wow, I didn't know I was going to end up I didn't know my daughter was going to end up in Brownsville, Texas on the border, trying to make a difference down there, and that's where she's at. Dealing with some challenges that we can't even imagine in Colonias, if anyone knows South Texas. I heard that word, I said, Colonias? That's messed up, man. No, not necessarily. Yeah. I'm glad I had some time for Q&A.
I am too. Thank you. Thank you for coming on and sharing your thoughts with us. So thank you guys for coming.
Thank you. Truly an honor.